Well, now let me introduce our second keynote speaker, who is none other than Professor Masaaki Shirakawa from Aoyama Gakuin University, who also served as the governor of Bank of Japan from 2008 to 2013. And this time, Professor and former Governor Masaaki Shirakawa will give us another keynote speech. So please welcome him with a big round of applause.
I thank Governor Lee and Bank of Korea for inviting me to speak at this international conference. It is my great honor and pleasure. And just now, we have heard a very stimulating keynote speech by Professor Roab Ho. And in the presence of distinguished scholars like Roab Ho or Thomas Sargent, I'm a bit intimidated. And bearing in mind to offer the maximum value added, I have decided to frame my keynote speech based on my experience as a long-term career central banker. I joined the Bank of Japan in 1972 after graduating from university and spent almost my entire professional life at the Bank of Japan, including a 5-year term between 2008 and 2013 as a governor, which was a really turbulent period. Looking back on my professional life, I can say confidently that central banking is really a fascinating job. I want to emphasize this particularly to younger staff at the Bank of Korea. At the same time, I would also say that it is becoming a really challenging job as well. Sorry, it's not working. Oh, okay. Okay. Before the global financial crisis, academics and central bankers were rather sanguine about the ability of central banks and their management of monetary policy aimed at macroeconomic stability. Bob Lucas, who is my teacher in Chicago, famously said in 2001 at his presidential address of American Economic Association that the central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes. Good economic performance, characterized by low volatility of growth and inflation rate, was applauded as a great moderation. Policy-wise, inflation targeting was hailed as the successful framework for monetary policy. At the time, I was rather uneasy with such mainstream view. I often express my uneasiness in various international meetings in the light of Japanese post-bubble experiences. However, many interpreted poor economic performance of Japan, which is often dubbed as the lost decades, simply as a phenomena attributable to policy failures unique to Japan. Then the global financial crisis erupted, and the global financial system was on the brink of collapse. Although we succeeded in averting collapse by eventually taking aggressive actions, a prolonged period of subdued growth ensued. And that's why Larry Summers presented the idea of secular stagnation. Yes, we are finally seeing global recovery, but the current growth path is actually not that different from the started fact in post-crisis period identified by Carmen Reichelt and Ken Rogoff. In particular, we should note that comparing post-bubble growth paths of Japan in the 1990s with other Western countries since 2007, there is no material difference, despite the fact that the unconventional monetary policy has been deployed so aggressively this time around. We have to take these developments seriously. Economic and social scars in post-bubble period were huge. Concerning Japanese economy, many people have now come to understand that its performance was not so bad as is implied by the word of lost decades. True, Japan's growth rate is low, But if we adjust for demographic change, it is reasonably well in international comparison. The silver lining of the global financial crisis is some signs of soul-searching and rethinking of mainstream macroeconomics that was so dominant. Policy-wise, 1 year ago, Professor Gertler at the New York University, who is known for being a harsh critic of Bank of Japan monetary policy, said at the Bank of Japan International Conference, "It is no longer possible to blame the stagnation in Japan on mismanagement of monetary policy." My uneasiness with the mainstream view prior to the global financial crisis simply came from my hands-on observation that it was so at odds with Japanese experience in the post-bubble period. A good starting point for discussion is a monetary policy framework. The conduct of monetary policy in many countries were heavily influenced by inflation targeting, or at least a mindset of inflation targeting, if not adopted formally. Inflation targeting rests on several assumptions. The most obvious and critical one is that objective of monetary policy can be defined as price stability. Price stability is surely important, but after all, it turned out that it does not necessarily guarantee macroeconomic stability. In retrospect, it was financial imbalances, not inflation, that caused major economic disasters, at least in advanced economies over the past 3 decades. Financial imbalances created under prolonged monetary easing, especially combination of excessive leverage and elevated asset prices, were often neglected or treated as a problem that should be better addressed by financial supervision and regulation. This argument is supplemented by the belief among economists regarding the effectiveness of aggressive monetary easing after the bursting of a bubble. Why did we neglect signs of financial imbalances in conducting monetary policy? Obviously, policymakers and academics, economists, and central banks were enormously influenced by aforementioned mainstream view among academics. I do not deny its influence, but it is not the full story. We also need to examine the influence stemming from public governance mechanism as well. The independence of the central bank means that society delegates the authority to conduct monetary policy to unelected officials. This naturally calls for proper public accountability mechanism in democracy. Inflation targeting perfectly fit well with the idea of independence and accountability. First, it is natural to set a target inflation rate once central bank is mandated to achieve price stability by legislators. Second, inflation number is easy to monitor. Third, the central bank is supposed to have an effective instrument of monetary policy to achieve that target. So inflation targeting was welcome and has been successfully implemented by many countries. I would call the underlying economic philosophy two goals, two instrument approach in that price stability and financial stability are clearly separated. Inflation targeting was an institutionalization of this underlying philosophy. Its flip side was the relative disregard of financial stability, although it was long viewed as the most fundamental mission of many central banks. Financial stability did not fit well with the current framework of independence and accountability. First, it is hard to measure and monitor financial stability. Second, multiple instruments as well as cooperation between relevant authorities are needed in achieving financial stability. Third, the time horizon for assessing financial stability is much longer than that for price stability, as is conventionally understood. I do not think that original architect of inflation targeting totally disregarded importance of financial stability. In this respect, we should note that subtle dynamics arising from the interaction of benign macroeconomic conditions, mainstream macroeconomics, and institutional design it seemed that the disregard of financial stability was in part an intended consequence of the very design of inflation targeting. Like any other institutional framework, inflation targeting was designed as a response to a particular environment. A typical example is the formal adoption of inflation targeting, pioneered by New Zealand in 1990, where it was critical for central banks to gain credibility against a long history of inflation. Such context dependency is not unique to inflation targeting. Another example is monetary policy framework, which Paul Volcker adopted by using the rhetoric of monetarism in combating rampant inflation in the US in 1979. The intellectual idea that price stability guarantees macroeconomic stability was reasonably appropriate in the 1970s and 1980s, but it was no longer so in the 2000s, at least in many Western countries. Best monetary policy framework is not fixed, but it evolves. We need a constant reality check of theory, institution, and actual state of the economy and the financial system. Because the economy and the financial system are very complex, adaptive systems, Japan had already achieved in the 1980s what inflation targeting countries tried to achieve. Consumer price inflation rate was low and stable. In retrospect, Japanese experience since late 1980s was foreshadowing what Western countries will experience since early 2000. In terms of a reality check of current monetary policy framework, I would like to draw your attention to the following three developments which disturb me today. First, we have to be aware that measurement of the inflation rate, which is the very basis of inflation targeting, is becoming a more challenging job. Looking into the future, how confident can we be in measuring prices of goods and services reasonably correctly, or decompose nominal expenditure into P and Q? Adjusting for qualitative change is already a daunting task, but knowing prices itself will become further complicated. For instance, if you tap Google Map app on your smartphone, you can use quite accurate navigation free of charge. Imagine how much you spent before to install a decent car navigation system. Presumably, we can think this as a kind of exchange of personal data for navigation service. Thus, we pay something to Google, but how to reflect that transaction to price index is nothing but a formidable task. It was not so long ago that Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan defined price stability in a more philosophical way. What they stressed was the public's perception that price changes do not materially affect decisions of economic agents over any meaningful time span. At the end of the day, this definition captures the very spirit of price stability. Admittedly, it is hard for central banks to be seen as accountable without referring to measured month-to-month change in inflation numbers. But we should keep in mind that what people at large expect of central banks is this basic trust of price stability. Second, we have to recognize that intertwining of price stability and the financial system gains more importance in future, as long as the recent decline in potential growth rate and over-reliance on aggressive monetary policy continues. As to a decline in potential growth rate, we have not fully understood its root cause. There are several hypotheses presented: deleveraging, demographics, introduction of inefficient policy measures amid the rise of populism, adverse effect of prolonged monetary easing on resource allocation, less innovation, among others. I will not dig into these hypotheses today. Rather, I'm interested in implications of prolonged monetary easing for financial stability. In case people do not recognize or are not willing to accept the reality of a decline in potential growth rate. Monetary easing is essentially about bringing forward future demand to the present. It works for a certain period of time, but it does not work for extended period of time. In the case of Japan, for example, extremely accommodative monetary policy has been deployed for the past 20 years. In the case of other advanced economies, it has been deployed for 10 years. Bringing forward future demand to the present means more debt, either public or private, is owed at the level of a country as a whole. And this debt has to be repaid by future income. We have to have legitimate concern over financial stability stemming from a combination of more debt and a declining potential growth rate. Third, we have to recognize that global forces are of growing importance in setting monetary policy. It is becoming less meaningful to analyze inflation development by solely focusing on domestic output gap. At the same time, however, we have not yet reached a stage in which inflation is determined by the global output gap. Although the truth is certainly somewhere in between, I believe the global economy is heading in the direction of more influences from global factors. Financial conditions affecting spending decision and asset allocation in each country are increasingly global in nature rather than domestic. Global financial conditions are increasingly determined by collective monetary policy action of central banks, especially central banks in major economies. This creates a problem of coordination failure. The problem becomes acute, especially in the face of zero lower bound of interest rate. Japan has long been deemed having a safe haven currency and was faced with a zero lower bound of interest rate far ahead of other advanced economies. As long as global uncertainty became elevated, say due to a debt crisis in Europe, global investors' demand for safety increased. Although Japan was hit by strong differential impact due to yen's appreciation caused by safe haven flows, it did not have effective instrument with which to counteract, simply because of strictures to its yield curve relative to peers. The short end of the yield curve was particularly at zero, and the long end of yield curve was as low as 1.3% before Lehman Brothers collapse, while the yield on 10-year bond in the US, Europe was at around 4.5%. Simply put, Japan had no way to create monetary policy divergence in favor of exchange rate depreciation. This has huge implications for other countries. The basis of inflation targeting as an accountability device is reasonable correspondence between monetary policy and policy goals at the domestic level. But the validity of this assumption is being gradually eroded as the globalization progresses further. Can you imagine the situation when many advanced economies are hit simultaneously by truly global shock, which collectively push many countries in the same situation as Japan experienced in the face of the zero lower bound? I've just finished discussing monetary policy implication due to the design of central bank governance, mainly from the perspective of accountability, which gives legitimacy to independence of central bank. But as previous discussion suggests, we need to discuss the design of independence as well. Traditionally, central bank's independence has been understood as independence from the government or politics. But if government or politics does not do what they are expected to do, what would happen? If that is the case, there is a serious risk that central bank could become a machine for doing what government or parliament is not willing to do because of political unpopularity. In this case, central bank independence could not deliver good economic performance, and in the worst case, it could backfire. After the global financial crisis, we saw monetary policy activism on a global scale, or the phenomena that central banks become the only game in town. This phenomena is partly due to the belief of the effectiveness of unconventional monetary policy, but it is also due to the fact that economic and fiscal reform struggle to get public support. If that is the case, the central bank is pushed into a position to do something in the face of subdued growth. Monetary easing, if prolonged, tends to lower the potential growth rate by inducing firms to undertake less productive investment with regard to investment schedule available for entire economy. If central bank is faced with inaction on the part of the government to implement credible fiscal reform, as Professor Neil Wallace and Thomas Sargent said many years ago, unpleasant monetarist arithmetic kicks in, and price stability, and eventually financial stability will be eroded. I would say this old situation is called by, so to speak, the independence trap. Two conditions at the least have to be met if we were not to fall into this trap. One is a mechanism for ensuring financial sustainability. Although there is no panacea, establishing an independent office for verifying fiscal sustainability is an important step. The other is a mechanism for ensuring effective resolution of troubled financial institutions in general, and injection of capital in particular. In the post-bubble period, Japan was lacking in both. In such a situation, like it or not, policies of forbearance was inevitable. It was a double-edged sword. Because of it, Japan could avoid a sharp contraction of economic activity, unlike the US. But because of it, it took many years to restore the health of the financial system. In contrast, the US restored the health of its financial system relatively quickly by using the TARP fund and implementing a credible stress test for financial institutions, which was really a great success. Ironically, this was made possible because the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers was so devastating to the entire economy and the financial system, and Congress finally realized the need for injecting public money quickly. I do not know which one is better. After all, it reflects social choice in each country. What I can say is that both forbearance and disorderly resolution are equally bad. We have to put mechanisms for ensuring effective resolution of troubled financial institutions in place. Listening to my remarks, you may be inclined to adopt a somewhat pessimistic view towards the future of the central bank. That is not my intention. After all, central bankers are professional warriors, and thus I spend most of my time on explaining about what we should worry. But there are many positive differences as well. First, now, we now have a more efficient and safer payment system. When I joined the Bank of Japan in 1972, there was no real-time gross settlement. There was no delivery versus payment. There was no payment versus payment. Now we have all of them. Without these, the global financial crisis would have been much more severe. We should not underestimate the positive contribution that central banks around the globe have made in cooperation with private sectors. I left my final page in the table, but the recording the memory I tried to say. And the second positive event is growing cooperation among central banks. When I was faced with Lehman shock, and each day, every day, we met, we made a conversation over the phone call. And the close communication among central bankers are really important. And given that each central bank is constrained by law in each country, we have to live up to this reality. And to overcome this limitation, the cooperation among central banks is critically important. And what we have to achieve by this cooperation is the following. If I'm asked, what is central bank? I would say central bank is an ever-learning institution. Every time over time, economy and financial system changes. Thus, best monetary policy framework evolve. And we have to identify what would strengthen the sustainability of economy and the financial system, and what are the spot. And if I use a word by Professor Robert Hall, the discount rate shock is critically important. And at the end of the day, the growing bubble and eventual collapse of financial system could change discount value, and which is my reading of Professor Hall's presentation. But anyway, the central bank is an ever-learning institution, and I hope that many people working for central banks try to do best for being an ever-learning institution. Thank you very much for your kind attention.